Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today. If you caught the earlier show with Michael Veitch, yes, his microphone went a bit iffy at the end. I've already arranged with him. We're going to bring him back in and do a part two to continue our discussion about Borneo in 1945. But today, or right now, 22 years ago, today's guest was on a Normandy tour I was guiding, and he introduced me then to the story of Lloyd Chadburn. Well, Robert Forbes has an expanded new book called Angel in a Spitfire to replace the original book, which I have a treasured copy of here. Links to the new book can, of course, be found in the description below. But it's really nice to bring back someone on I first encountered amazing 22 years ago. So I'll bring him in now. So good afternoon, Robert. How are you today?
We're fantastic today. Sunny
Brilliant
day.
stuff. So, I mean, it's just, as I said to you a minute ago before we went live, it's just great to catch up with someone like yourself. And you're one of those people that, like so many people I've had, you kind of almost stumbled across a story that you start off thinking is a small story. And then, like all of these stories, it leads to all this spider's web of different directions and to a point where I remember you telling me 22 years ago, people didn't know much about this story.
Yeah.
Well, people do know a little bit about the story now. I mean, it maybe isn't global yet, but it certainly has reached a certain level of notoriety. And you must have, before we get into your presentation, that must be very, very rewarding for you to see something expand and become, and make your place in recording this incredible hero story.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's we're Canadian, right? So we don't really venerate our heroes that much, particularly in the Air Force, and particularly those who didn't come back for the most part. And so that's an issue certainly here in Canada, and we don't trumpet ourselves too much around the world. So it's all the same kind of thing. And so yeah, seeing other people out there and people reaching back to me, yourself from France. I've been in contact with several people in the UK. I'm going there next month, and I've got a couple of presentations and another couple of visits to do about Chadburn. I'm really excited to be able to share this story because, as you said, and as you said a few years ago in your book review, it's an incredible story. It's got all the elements that you'd want, and it is rewarding. It's very, very comforting to me to know that that this message is getting out and people are beginning to recognize it.
And as we will find out, it has an international element as well. In that, we tend to think of, well, all the Canadians are flying together and all the Brits are flying together. Well, that's not how the Air Force worked back then. There was all this overlap and units and squadrons and groups flying with each other and supporting the Americans and supporting the Brits. And I love anything that reminds us that the World War II effort was collaborative and countries working alongside each other. But I'm going to hand over to you to take us through this presentation, folks. If you've got specific questions about the details on the screen, we'll kind of deal with them. But I think a lot of your questions will be answered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to Robert to take us through this story. And if you don't know it, it's a doozy. So over to you, sir.
Absolutely. So Wing Commander Lloyd Chadburn. And if he was an American, there'd be movies about him already, maybe 5 or 6. Who knows? It's not my words. I hear it all the time. But every person I've ever met who knew him personally could never find sufficient words to express how they felt about him. He was universally loved and admired, and he made his mark in an area of the air war that is largely ignored: fighter operations in Northwest Europe between the Battle of Britain and D-Day. In fact, I was at a historians conference a couple of months ago, and this historian stands up to talk about the effect or the impact of the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War. And he goes, blah, 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 Battle of Britain, blah, 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 Bomber Command, and, and then after Normandy. And it's like, wait a minute, there was this whole section in the middle that you've just completely ignored. And so it happens all the time, even amongst people who should know better. He concluded the war as Canada's highest decorated fighter pilot, a title later surpassed by Wing Commander George Kiefer. But his tragic death just after D-Day cut his incredible story up short. So, who was Lloyd Chadburn? And why was he one of the most admired leaders of the RCAF? And why did the Americans, of all people, nickname him the Angel? Well, let's jump into the middle of his story. because it's 20th of August today.
Yep.
The Canadian-led raid to Dieppe in France was going to be a short incursion. It was going to be protected by the largest air armada yet put together. 54 fighter squadrons, including 6 RCAF Spitfire units. The raid, of course, was a complete disaster for the ground forces with enormous casualties, but the air forces would report some good successes. Claims for nearly 100 enemy aircraft were destroyed, were made by the Allied Air Forces, although that was double what the actual number was. And we lost just over 60 pilots. And the 6 RCAF squadrons claimed 14 destroyed or probably destroyed for a loss of 8 aircrew. And one of the newest operational Canadian Spitfire squadrons, number 416, has spent most of the year in Scotland, flying cover for convoys, and they have moved just south just in time to participate in this raid. Dieppe would be the first time that the squadron operated as a full-size unit of 12 aircraft in the air under the command of 22-year-old squadron leader Lloyd Chadburn. There would be 4 patrols over the assault area starting at 0650, and when 416 Squadron, who was on the 3rd shift, arrived over the smoky town at 5,000 feet, they could see enemy aircraft in the distance. But none ever came close to their operational area. And a 2nd patrol at 1050 put the pilots over the beachhead just as the troops were beginning to start their withdrawal. And flying 7,000 feet above Chadburn, 616 Squadron, Royal Air Force, were providing top cover, and they engaged and damaged 4 Focke-Wulf 190 German fighters. But the enemy aircraft that broke through the top cover turned away before 416 could engage at the lower altitude. So as would occur with each patrol, Chadburn Squadron returned to Hawkinge near Dover information. And takeoffs, also executed information, were likened to a cavalry charge by one of the pilots, as all of the Spitfires all lined up abreast and they all took off at once. I imagine it was great fun. On the 3rd patrol, most of the troops had been evacuated and they were pulling away from France. So while flying toward a reported battle area, more than a dozen Luftwaffe FW-190s appeared directly behind and slightly above the Canadians of 416 in a perfect position to bounce or attack the squadron. But performing what was later described as the best tight turn information we ever executed, Chadburn led the 12 Spitfires to turn the tables on the attacking Focke-Wulf 190s. It was a textbook demonstration of the fighter leader's mission to bring maximum guns to bear on the enemy. The Germans were surprised and quickly overwhelmed, and Chadburn's pilot scored 3 destroyed. The enemy fighter scattered, and 616 Squadron, flying top cover, was able to damage 1 more as it tried to escape. Chadburn pulled the squadron back together to resume their mission and then spied a formation of 7 Junkers Ju-88 bombers preparing to attack a convoy of retreating ships. Chadburn again led the squadron into the attack, forcing the bombers to jettison their bomb load and flee, with all of the bombers being damaged and 1 probably destroyed. Chadburn himself claimed a probable and a damaged aircraft, with victories shared amongst 8 of the 12 pilots in the air on that mission. In their first operation as a whole unit, 416 Squadron was the top scoring RCAF squadron overall that day, and it suffered no casualties. He was the only RCAF squadron commander chosen to speak on a radio broadcast the next day about Dieppe, heard all across Canada, and it was his 23rd birthday. 5 RCAF pilots were awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions during the Dieppe raid, and Chadburn was explicitly awarded for his leadership of 416. And I'll note the citation, which includes these words. This achievement reflects the greatest credit on this officer's excellent leadership, and he has inspired confidence in those under his command. Now, one of the things that really stands out for me is that through bad luck and bad timing on Chadburn's part, this was only his 2nd engagement with enemy aircraft. So how did a guy who arguably was quite new, even though he had been in the Air Force for 2 years, he'd been overseas for 18 months, and this is his second opportunity. But how did he make such a success of himself, and more importantly, a success of his squadron on their first try at combat?
Just to interrupt you for a second, Robert. I mean, Sheldrake over in your part of the world said, I believe it was the largest air battle of the war in Western Europe, 66 fighter squadrons and 8 bomber squadrons. And I think, you know, there's lots to be said about Dieppe raid, and most of it is negative. Most of it is, you know, the speculation of what it was all about and was it worth it. And we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But it seems to me that the air part of it just isn't talked about at all.
No, it really isn't. There's, I think, you know, it gets a bare minimum. I mean, the bomber missions were a bit of a farce. Because they weren't actually dropping bombs, believe it or not. They were dropping incendiaries and smoke in front of the guns to blind the shore batteries. But this book that I have here, the Norman Franks book, The Greatest Air Battle, that's the only one I've ever found that really talks about the Dieppe raid in any kind of detail.
And I suppose at the time, with the tragedy of the losses on the beaches, it might have seemed a bit of a PR stunt to try and big up too much the air successes. It would have been seen as a bit, well, what about the guys on the beaches? So I can understand at the time why there was they didn't ignore it. I'm sure things made the press, and to say that the gallantry award there is clear for us to read, but it would have felt a bit off to just try and deflect attention away from what happened on the beaches to this air war, even if it was, as you said, largely successful, the fighter aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, this interview that he had with the CBC, it was an hour-long interview called Dieppe Roundup. You know, and of course, you know, they're interviewing the guys who made it back, who were largely telling it the way that it was, which wasn't particularly flattering. But they did manage to get, 5 minutes in of Lloyd Chadburn and one of his pilots, who definitely painted a different story. But he was all over how brave the guys on the ground were, and he completely downplayed himself, as was his nature.
Okay, thank you.
So to understand a story, I think we need to go back to the war, before the war. Lloyd, he really wanted to join the Air Force, but the RCAF at the time was very, very tiny, and an officer needed a university degree, and so they turned him down. So he worked in a bank, and he had none of the other qualifications that might have endeared him to the Royal Air Force, which many Canadians joined in the late 1930s. Like many Canadians, he also played hockey, loved skiing. He had a really tight bunch of friends. So when war broke out, he applied again and quit his job in the bank because he knew it was and they turned him down again. So they weren't really ready for the mass influx of applicants, is the bottom line. They had to get their house in order. So finally, by the middle of April 1940, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was ready for warm bodies, and he was sworn in into this big mob, 196 people here. So he started his basic training at the Manning Depot in Toronto. Basic training lasted 2 weeks. And then he was sent on to the newly opened No. 1 Initial Training School as part of the first class, where they would decide if he would be a pilot or, as he was afraid, an air gunner. He had an interview with a psychologist who said, yeah, not so much a pilot, maybe you'll be a good air gunner. And so this was his greatest fear the entire time that he was undergoing basic training or flying training. So after the first school, they decided he might make a pilot. Now, the RCAF still didn't have any basic training facilities for pilots. They were all under construction. And so in groups of 5 to 7 students, they were sent all around civilian schools to learn how to fly on this kind of airplane here, the Tiger Moth. And as you can see, it's pretty casual. They decided, he might be there. So there they are, the boys. But flying didn't really come very easy to him. He failed his navigation test. Oh, definitely going to be an air gunner now. He had a failed engine. He landed in a farmer's field with his Tiger Moth going nose down after it completed the landing. No damage to pilot or aircraft, only the propeller was broken. After successfully rewriting his navigation exam, he passed his various flying tests, and young Chadburn actually finished 9th in his wider class of 29, noted as a consistent and quick thinker, willing to do the extra work to master the subjects, although he was only an average pilot. After completing his next round of training at the intermediate training in Ottawa on to Harvard, he was awarded his pilot wings in October 1940, much to his surprise and his delight. Literally to the day before he got his wings, he was writing letters home to Mom saying, "I don't think I'm ever going to make it as a pilot. My landings are terrible. I haven't done aerobatics for weeks." He just absolutely did not believe that he was ever going to make it as a pilot. And then he got his wings. Quelle surprise. So he was on to the next squadron where he was going to learn more subjects. But now, instead of being an air gunner, his concern was he was going to end up as an instructor, because all the good pilots were all getting plowed back into the system now that the schools were opening up, right? So he was again rated as an average pilot, and he finished 4th in his class. And this is his class here. He's hiding out in the back, looking a bit goofy right here. But along with 9 other classmates, he was going to get sent overseas to join the RCAF in England. And even more surprising to him, he was commissioned to be an officer in the King's service, and that was a great delight. So prior to heading across the ocean, he proposes to his best girl, Eleanor Langford, and here she is. They had been dating for a couple of years at this point, and she accepted his proposal, much to his delight, but then a few days later turned him down, returning his ring in the mail. Heartbreak, right? So she didn't really understand this whole going in the Air Force business, and she was actually opposed to it. Understandably, Lloyd was heartbroken, but soon enough, he was on a ship headed for England, and he didn't have time to think about it anymore. He was assigned to a new fighter squadron that was forming in Digby in Lincolnshire. Number 2 RCAF squadron had just traded in their Lysanders for Hurricanes, and top Canadian ace Gordie McGregor would be the squadron commander. Gordie and 3 other pilots who were in the Battle of Britain were part of this new squadron. And at 39 years of age, Gordie McGregor was the oldest fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. Talk about being an old man. But he knew that his pilots would have to get up to speed, and get up to speed quickly. Chadburn's cohort was joined another week later by another 10 pilots, fresh from Canada. And these 20 fresh new pilots, unlike every other pilot that ever followed, would get no training in an operational training unit. He had to learn everything right there in that squadron. So McGregor trained them as hard as he could in the miserable winter conditions of 1941. And here we can see Chadburn standing on the wing of his Hurricane, getting ready for an early January flight. You can imagine it was bloody cold. And he's definitely all warm with all of the clothes that he's got going on. Oh, that didn't turn out well. But, you know, he soon got through it all. And after a whopping 36 hours of flying in a Hurricane, Chadburn was declared ready for operations. 36 hours. And shortly after that, the squadron, now renumbered as number 402, was declared operational. And so scrambles to intercept enemy aircraft, almost always friendly, and protective patrols over convoys on the east coast of Great Britain were what the operations were going to be.
But it's an odd period, isn't it? This the 41 period in England is there are people being sent off to North Africa, and people are becoming very good. And there's also the ground air cooperation is building over there. The peak of the Battle of Britain is in the past. The Brits and the Allies have won that, and all the nations. But it's not, to describe it as a lull is a bit unfair. But it's certainly an unusual period. It's sort of the calm between storms, but at the same time not calm. And do you think there was a bit of a stigma for the number of people who had been in the Battle of Britain against the people who hadn't been in the Battle of Britain, even though it was just a circumstance of date?
I don't think so, and here's why. Because they knew that it was everything had shut down because it's winter and it's dark.
Yeah,
that's right. But what's going to happen in the spring? Are we going to have another invasion attempt? Are we going to have another blitz? we don't know what's going to happen. So all we can do is get prepared for it. Now, the guy who was in charge of fighter command, Dowding, he got essentially shuffled off to Malta because he ran afoul of some other people. Yep. And the guy who was now in charge of fighter command and in charge of the Air Force, Portal and Leigh Mallory, they had this notion that, well, now that we've beat them back, we can do this lean into France and constant offensive and keep the Germans, off the attack. So, but it was still very much I think of a camaraderie amongst all the units. But everything that I've read about the Royal Air Force squadrons, which would have had a greater percentage of Battle of Britain veterans, it was still a very cohesive unit, much unlike what it was during the Battle of France, where the veterans from pre-war and the new pilots in the Battle of France did not mix during the phony war before that. But once the bullets started flying, they really all came together, quite cohesive. So as the theory goes, 402 Squadron's pilots are now ready for anything, or so they believed. And 8 of the pilots that you see here would not survive the war, and 3 more would be taken prisoner. But Chadburn has soon established himself as a steady leader, and he was quickly made a section leader on patrols and scrambles. Now, I love this picture. It's one of my favorites of all time because everybody's got their best kit on, and Chadburn, as you can see, second from the right at the back, he's got his top button undone, his tie's askew, his hands in his pockets, and he's got his ever-present goofy grin on. He's his own man. After more than 50 operational flights with 402 Squadron, mostly convoy patrols and scrambles, Chad was posted to the newly formed 412 Squadron, where he finally flew the Spitfire. And now he was one of the pilots teaching others the finer points of operational flying. This is a frame from a rare color film from 1941, and that's the blonde Lloyd Chadburn standing tall in the middle, mugging it for the camera. This was a film called Britain at War by Rosie Newman, who managed to talk people into letting her onto bases of all Army, Navy, Air Force, out to sea, and just everything. It was really quite a remarkable thing for a young lady to do. Shortly after helping to get 412 Squadron operational, Chadburn received a new posting and finally got a promotion as well. He was sent to serve as flight commander with number 19 Squadron, Royal Air Force, which was flying from Matlask near Coltishall in Norfolk. Again, the unit was rebuilding after losing 9 pilots in the preceding month, including the squadron commander and both flight leaders. But Chadburn would be training up the new pilots, but he was still thrilled with the pace of the operation and the cosmopolitan nature of his flight, which included Canadians, British, Australians, Rhodesians, and even Czech pilots. And by this time, the Germans had invaded Russia. And so the threat of invasion had diminished significantly, but the Germans were still sending bombers and fighter bombers over just to be an annoyance from time to time, but primarily they were just holding their own. In the rainy autumn of 1940, or rainy autumn of 1941, as it set in, the weather turned sour, creating ideal conditions for operational flights that they codenamed Rhubarb. These missions involved 2 or 3 fighters flying at wave-top height across the channel just below the cloud to look for targets of opportunity. The higher-ups felt that this is what they could do to keep the Germans off balance, leaning into France and feeling good about the offensive, helping Russia. And it was sold to the pilots as an opportunity for action, with a low risk of being shot down by enemy aircraft due to the low cloud, and also safe from anti-aircraft fire due to the surprise nature of the attack. None of these things proved to be true at all, and squadron leaders and wing commanders came to hate them. Chadburn seized this opportunity for action and set off to attack an airfield in Holland with a veteran wingman. His navigation was slightly off, and they ended up over a well-defended Kriegsmarine harbor. Despite this, they managed to shoot up a destroyer without sustaining any damage to themselves, and Chadburn also famously shot up a trio of enemy torpedo boats, much like we would see in this painting here, and received a congratulatory letter from the Admiralty for his efforts. And despite his peers at every squadron having opportunities to engage German aircraft, Chadburn kept missing out due to being on the wrong mission, being on leave, or not being on call. But finally, in the January of 1942, Chadburn and his commanding officer had a chance to engage a retreating Junkers Ju-88. And they knocked some pieces off of it, and Chadburn fired literally until he expended all of his ammunition. And he earned a shared credit for a damaged aircraft. And a second in command of the squadron, he often led the unit, including on the ill-fated effort to stop the Scharnhorst on the Channel run. But shortly after, he had gotten the transfer he was requesting. He was tired of the cloud, the rain, the cold. He wanted to go to Malta or North Africa, or maybe even to the Far East. Unfortunately, he got sent to snowy Peterhead in the far north of Scotland. So that was not to be. And so he was very unhappy at being taken from an operational RAF squadron right on the Channel and literally stuck as far away from the action as possible. But change was in the wind, and 416 Squadron had been just declared operational, and it had 29 brand new, novice pilots. But there was an effort to have Canadian pilots, Canadian squadrons commanded and staffed by Canadians, a process that we called Canadianization. And so at 22 years of age, Lloyd Chadburn became the first graduate of the British Commonwealth training plan to command a squadron, and he was also the youngest squadron leader as well. So Chadburn took stock of his squadron quickly and realized that they needed that familiar touch. Training, and more training. In fact, in the month of March, under Chadburn's leadership, the squadron more than doubled the amount of training hours and led all operational squadrons. On the home front, Chad continued to stew about Eleanor's rejection, but a chance encounter with a lovely young waif named Vera Broomfield kicked him out of those doldrums. And when they met, they were both on leave and they had an instant connection. And she was the section officer at the maintenance depot near Carlisle, which is on the other coast of Great Britain. And he often took his suddenly unreliable Spitfire all the way across Scotland over to the depot for repairs. Got to be right. But after the excitement at Dieppe, 416 Squadron was ordered to join the Kenley Wing, which also had 3 other RCAF squadrons in it. And 416 would be based at nearby Red Hill, 7 miles away. The pace of operational missions was pretty steady at Kenley, convoy patrols and air-sea rescue missions, but were also beginning to escort the new US B-17 bomber groups that were just arriving. And Chadburn also had opportunities to lead the whole wing during some of these escort missions. It was during this time that 416 adopted this nose art of the lynx and maple leaf. And it was also during this time that Chadburn initiated the process to get the squadron adopted by the city of Oshawa, his old hometown. And he would become known as the City of Oshawa Squadron, as you can see is painted on this airplane. So this was actually the very first of very many RCAF squadrons to be adopted by towns and cities across the country. A process that ships had for a long time, and regiments, of course, have as well. After a successful day in operations, the boys of 416 went to the officers' mess at Red Hill, a lovely old rambling residence for a party, a thrash, as Chad would call it. And when they arrived, there was an older group of RAF officers, from the station. They were in the mess with their wives. Introductions, and everybody went to their own side. But Chad felt that their party was lacking something. So he sent a trio of pilots led by his wingman, Jackie Ray, into town to bring back some women or maybe get some wafts from nearby Nutfield Priory. Ray left and broke up a local Saturday night dance with stockings and chocolates and returned with a truck full of women. And the Canadians had a lively party, much to the dismay of the stuffier RAF types who left in a huff. The next day, the pilots and their squadron leader were brought into the base commander's office to answer for the complaint of having the embarrassing behavior of pilots and their guests. Chadburn intervened with mock disgust. "You can be sure, sir, that I will deal with these unfortunate pilots in the most severe way." And the group captain let them off into Chadburn's custody. Ray pointed out, "Sir, this whole thing was your idea." And of course, Chadburn just, la, 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 I can't hear you. And he moved on. As the new year of 43 began, Chadburn's tour of operations, granting him a month's leave, came to an end, and he had 320 hours in his first tour of operational flying time, and you're only supposed to get 200 hours for a full tour, so he was definitely well due. And while he relished time with family and friends, his leave was completely consumed with duty. He met or called with families of his men in 416. He attended numerous civic receptions, presentations, and he also took time to meet with other Air Force trainees. The month of leave passed quickly, and Chadburn was eager to return to England and his comrades. His last two crossings were aboard high-speed luxury ocean liners, the Cunard, Samaria, and the Canadian Pacific vessel, the Empress of Scotland. This time, though, he traveled aboard this much slower freighter, the Manchester Trader. The journey was perilous, and to avoid a massive U-boat battle in the mid-Atlantic, the whole convoy diverted north, leading them into a field of icebergs. 9 ships were damaged by icebergs, and 1 was actually sunk. Oh, I hate when this... My slides did not quite translate as I moved them around, but there you go. Upon his return, Chad and his friends met with his friends at 416, and he brought news from home before being sent to Digby for a month of retraining with 412 Squadron. And once ready, he rejoined the Kenley wing as a supernumerary while he waited for the squadron to have an opening for a leader. Chadburn was now under the command of Ace Wing Commander Johnny Johnson of the RAF, and Johnson was a very aggressive leader. He led his 2 Canadian squadrons to very high scores, and he would actually finish the war himself as the top ace for the RAF, scoring the majority of his victories while leading Canadian squadrons. A squadron posting did come available, and it was not with 416 as Chad had hoped, but it was back to 402 in Digby. He did have some satisfaction, having an opportunity to lead the squadron that he had started with. And he was flying now under Sid Ford, a well-regarded Canadian ace. He's doing escort missions for anti-shipping strikes with Beaufort fighters. And that was a normal mission. But Ford was only in his role for a month and a half before he was lost in one of these convoy attacks. And you can see here in this picture some of the chaos and fury of a Beaufighter convoy attack. Chadburn was promoted to replace him, and to Chadburn's delight, 416 City of Oshawa Squadron had just relocated to Digby and would be part of his wing. And so now that would reunite him with his 2 old squadrons, and he was the wing co, or the wing leader, or the wing commander flying, the man who operationally led the unit into action, and the administrative tasks were left for others to perform. So here we see Chad in his new Iron, as he called his airplanes, marked with his initials, LVC. Wing leaders marked their aircraft with their own initials, starting with Douglas Bader back in March of 1941. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this was much to the dismay of intelligence officers who figured that Germans would seek out these airplanes and shoot them down. So the RAF Digby in the Lincolnshire is in the middle of the country, and it's considered a backwater where squadrons typically rested, recuperated, and retrained. However, Chadburn was not content with that situation, and he charmed his way into frontline operations for his wing. And soon Chadburn and his Digby traveling circus, they were flying to forward bases all along the English Channel to provide escort missions for the growing Allied bombing and strafing missions into France and Holland. But Chadburn's dedication to training and improving both squadrons in his wing meant that every day during the summer of 1943 was filled with some form of training. Even on operational days, as they flew to their advanced bases or returned home, wing formations and cloud flying exercises were always conducted. Chadburn squadrons were flying the clipped wing Spitfire Mark V LF. Now, LF stands for Low Altitude Fighter. And that means that the Digby wing was at a disadvantage against enemy aircraft at high altitude. So they were tasked with the bomber escort, or close escort for bombers at a medium altitude. That meant that Johnson's Kenley wing and others like it, who were equipped with a more capable Spitfire Mark IX, took on the first line of defense while tasking with their tasking of high escort. Chadburn's close escort would only engage if and when the enemy broke through the top cover. As Johnson said, he pitied the poor close escort that only gets the crumbs. And this is true. You know, through June and July of 1943, Johnson's wing scored 31 destroyed airplanes. Chad's close escort accounted for only 8. Now, the U.S. Army Air Force had initially deployed Martin B-26 Marauders in the Pacific and then the Mediterranean theater as a low-altitude bomber, leading to some tragic outcomes. However, by the end of July of 1943, they figured out finally how to deploy them effectively, and these bombers would attack targets at medium altitude with Spitfire close escort and P-47 Thunderbolts or the Spitfire Mark IX as a high escort. Now, Chadburn and his wing of Mark V Spitfires were well suited for the close escort role, and from the end of July to the year's end, this was their primary mission. Occasionally, Chadburn would get to include the squadrons from Coltishall as part of his wing. And by September, Chadburn's escort was legendary. An Associated Press reporter interviewed American bomber crews who praised Chadburn's exceptional escort, dubbing him their guardian angel. That nickname certainly stuck, as you can see from this cartoon panel. It's from True Aviation Comics, and a comic book produced in the United States in the fall of 1944, with a cover story about Lloyd Chadburn, the airman's angel. Now, while luck played a role avoiding anti-aircraft fire, Chadburn's reputation held true. And the legend claimed that in over 60 escort missions flown by Chadburn and his Digby wing, only one bomber was lost to an enemy fighter, and that pilot paid for it with his life. That was the legend up until June of this year when my book came out. As with most legends, it's a bit mixed up. Yes, one fighter did break through to shoot at and hit a bomber, and Jeff Northcott in front of 402 Squadron was hot on its tail. But it escaped that day, and it was not shot down. That bomber, Payoff, was already going down due to flak damage. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Andrew Lindsay, was unable to open his escape hatch and was about to bail out through the open bomb bay doors of the flaming airplane when an FW-190 sprayed the airplane with cannon fire into the bomb bay just in front of Lindsay. 402 Squadron Leader Jeff Northcott was closing on its fast with his guns blazing, but the two fighters scattered in different directions just before they would have collided. And as soon as the shooting stopped, Lindsay dived through the flames of the open bomb bay doors. 4 of the crew members from Payoff survived, with 2, including Lindsay, making it back to England before the war's end to tell their story. And one unfortunately landed in the middle of a headquarters unit of a Panzer division, and the other one was arrested at the Spanish border. So the actual fact is that Chadburn's escort never allowed a bomber to go down to enemy fighters, but he would never learn that. And the actual number that Chadburn himself led, was not 60 close escort missions, but 100. So Chadburn was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, second to the Victoria Cross, in the summer of 1943, and it was due to his exceptional leadership of the Digby wing. And at the point of this being awarded, his wing was still on the rise and in fighter command and had not yet peaked. And Chad was the first RCAF leader to receive the DSO, but the citation says it all. Displayed exceptional leadership and great skill, while his fine fighting spirit has set a most inspiring example. Back on the home front, Vera, Chad's girlfriend of nearly 2 years, she wanted to get married to Lloyd. But he had become very firm in his opinion about that topic, and he was often quoted as saying, "Marriage should not happen to a fighter pilot who cannot divide his attentions between Mary at home and a screaming Spitfire." Sadly, they parted companies and went their separate ways. As the summer progressed, Chadburn's personal score and that of the Digby wing continued to climb, and this was partly due to a change in Luftwaffe tactics. As they focused on defending the fatherland from daylight B-17 raids, the Luftwaffe began engaging lower, where the close escort operated, rather than the high escort. And by November, the Digby wing was the highest scoring wing in fighter command, despite flying the older Spitfire model. The apex of Chadburn's time was a mission on November 3rd, 1943, Ramrod 290. He was escorting 72 Marauders to bomb the airfield at Amsterdam, Schiphol. At the rendezvous point, it became clear that instead of 2 boxes of 36 bombers, 1 box was split into 2 and separated by some miles. So Chadburn reorganized his escort to provide the best cover possible. And as they approached the airfield, the flak opened up and took the wing off one of the bombers. And this is the actual bomber that is going down. Bugs Bunny is its name. And then the full photograph at the very top right-hand corner, you can see the rest of the wing. Chadburn kept the well-trained escort steady through the heavy flak, and then they were heading back to England after the bombs had been dropped. As they crossed the sea, about 15 German fighters descended behind the first box, directly ahead of Chadburn and 402 Squadron. The enemy likely didn't see the rest of the bombers and escorts still in Holland, and so Chad quickly engaged the unaware Messerschmitt 109s. Numerous aircraft were going down and smoked both the 402 and 416 squadrons, while the Marauders safely and swiftly went home. When the wing arrived back at the staging base at Coltershall and the tally was taken, there were claims for 9 aircraft destroyed during the 9-minute air battle, a hallmark day for the wing. And quick to take advantage of the public relations windfall, a radio broadcast was set up by the CBC. Ugh, I hate when that happens. Chadburn would interview his pilots about their amazing mission, and it would later be broadcast across Canada. So the wing commander briefed his pilots and said that they needed to tell the story that they would have done better if they had more capable equipment. And that capable equipment should have been the Mark 9 Spitfires. Everybody enjoyed their moment in front of the microphone, but as soon as RCAF headquarters heard it, they scuttled the whole broadcast. Yeah, we're not talking about that. His tour as Digby wing commander was marked by great success in the air, with a high rate of victory over the enemy. But more important to Chad was his high rate of success in keeping his pilots and those he escorted safe. In his 6-month tour as wing commander flying, he lost 5 pilots in operation, all at low altitude. 3 of them were hit by debris, 1 by flak, and 1 literally just disappeared in the cloud. But his tour was over. He had 488 hours on operations. A chance encounter during a fog-extended layover at Hawkins near Dover, Chad met Nancy McKay, another WAF who had worked the plotting room there, and they hit it off. And when Chad's second tour was up in December, he took 2 weeks of leave to hang out in Dover, near Hawkins. At the end of his tour, he also received a second Distinguished Service Order, the first Canadian to receive this award twice, and one of only 4 who did. Chadburn famously commented on how his men put on a good show, and yet he received the awards. And the citation notes his outstanding leadership and great tactical skill, and that much of the success can be achieved to this officer's sterling qualities. Chad hated being a desk pilot, and so he charmed his way onto a war bond tour in Canada. In exchange, he got back onto operations 2 months early. And he took command of 127 Wing at RAF Tangmere from Wing Commander Hugh Godfrey, and he was finally in a Spitfire Mark IX. And this wing included 403 Squadron and 421 Squadron, along with City of Oshawa 416, which pleased him very, very much. Also at Tangmere would be 126 Wing, led by George Kiefer, and at nearby RAF 4, Johnny Johnson would lead the newly formed 144 Wing. But the role of wing leader had evolved in the intervening months since he last held the position. Spitfire pilots were now training unbelievably to be dive bombers. And the wing commander was forbidden from engaging in actual combat and instead had to lead from 12,000 feet. These attacks targeted rail yards, fortifications, priority targets such as were known as no-balls, which were in fact the launch sites for nearly complete V-1 bombs. But it was clear that everything was building to a fever pitch, and the invasion of the continent was imminent. By the end of May of 1944, there was minimal aerial opposition, as nearly all Luftwaffe fighters had been pulled back to defend Germany from the B-17. Despite this, Chadburn's Spitfires had accumulated an impressive score of 10 victories, placing them at the top of all the Spitfire wings in the 2nd Tactical Air Force. Johnny Johnson's wing had half that, and George Kiefer's wing even fewer. Chad offered a bet of 30 pounds from from D-Day, whenever that would be, until D+30, the wing with the highest score would win the 30 pounds and would host a party for the losing side. Johnson accepted the bet. Kiefer went, yeah, no, I'm out. And of course, June 6th marks the big day, and the Spitfires of the RCAF form part of the vast air umbrella over the invading fleet. Chadburn's wing covered the American sector, patrolling Utah and Omaha beaches, while the other wings flew over the British and Canadian beaches. In fact, there were 38 fighter wings, each with at least 36 aircraft in the air, providing constant cover from before dawn to after dusk. And contrary to popular belief, the Germans did in fact show up. The Allied air forces shot down 40 enemy fighters and bombers trying to attack the soldiers storming the beachhead. However, the RCAF wings saw no action in the air. The next few days were the same, but the invasion was not going well for Chad's 127 wing. Between engine failures and friendly anti-aircraft fire, they lost 4 pilots and hadn't even seen any German aircraft. They were getting pretty disheartened. U.S. Navy gunners had damaged Chadburn's LVC Spitfire and shot down his wingman, Eldon Williams. Williams was captured by the Germans and held until Cherbourg was liberated by the American Army. But as soon as the advanced landing grounds were ready, Chadburn led his wing and landed in France. On D+5 and D+6, 403 and 421 squadrons were able to make use of these rustic airfields, dusty rustic airfields. But by 13th of June, it had now been a week since the invasion started, and there was good progress being made on the beachhead, and several of the landing grounds were now in operations. 416 and 421 squadrons were going to spend the day in France. One final patrol of the western area, and they landed at their dusty airfield in Bosonville. Things were looking up. The wing was now going to be tasked to patrol the eastern area, where Canadian and British beaches were. But more importantly, that's where the Luftwaffe had been showing up. On the final patrol of the day, Chadburn received a report of potential enemy aircraft in the area, and he flew off with 416 Squadron to investigate, leaving 421 Squadron to orbit over the beachhead. Well, when Chadburn reached the reported area, he found it was only a squadron of American P-47s. So he turned back to rejoin the wing. And as they approached each other, 421 Commander Wally Conrad spotted the oncoming Spitfires in the cloud and turned to avoid a collision. Chadburn, leading 416, narrowly missed Conrad, but collided head-on with Frank Clark. Clark's aircraft exploded, and Chadburn's disintegrated. Frank Clark was killed instantly. Chadburn fell to the ground from 12,000 feet, still strapped in his seat. He died shortly after landing and was buried near Bénouville in France by the Royal Engineers who retrieved him. I actually found a map of the Normandy battlefield area and looked at where it was, and it's like, oh, it's at this crossroads. But as Paul points out, he says, yeah, there's now high rises and everything else there.
Yeah, the Bénouville area has expanded in recent years. It's amazing that you're able to pinpoint the detail. I'm just wanted to say that it's amazing how much, but not amazing and not surprising how much extra layers of detail you've added since the first book that I've had for these last 22 years. So the reason I'm not saying much is I'm basically hanging off every word you say, Robert. So that's yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, the war carries on, of course, and 403 Squadron Leader Bob Buckham was made wing commander to take over from Chad, and he picked up Chad's bet against Johnny Johnson. Buckham had flown with Chadburn since February of 1942, but was only a wing leader for a couple of months until his tour was over. And when Buckham was told he was going home in August, he told his commander, Group Captain Bill McBrien, I will take a boat back across the channel. He did not want to fly anymore, not even one last time. He did not expect he was going to survive the war after he heard about Chadburn's death. He stayed in the Air Force, funny enough. He stayed in the Air Force after the war, but was killed in a flying accident in 1947. So what happened to the bet? 127 wing, now led by Buckham, took the lead with a banner day on June 15th, destroying 7 enemy aircraft. They defended their lead until July 5th, when Johnny Johnson, leading 443 Squadron, shot down 8 aircraft, winning the bet 42-39. A large party was held shortly afterwards, with the victors hosting a celebration in Lloyd Chadburn's honor. Now, Wings Abroad was the official newspaper of the RCAF overseas, and it published every 2 weeks. But through its entire run from December of 40 to June 1945, it told the story of the RCAF overseas in Europe and the Pacific Theater. And it did so without ever giving away any operational secrets, of course, and the publication of regular casualty lists were there, even if only in teeny-weeny print, but it was there. But throughout the publication, it never ran an obituary for anyone who was killed until Lloyd Chadburn died.
Mm.
And I never found another obituary after that either. Following the war, the newly formed French government awarded decorations to notable Allied servicemen. 12 Canadians received the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, but only 4 of them were actually operational pilots, Lloyd Chadburn among them. The rest were headquarter level officers. And the citation for Chadburn describes him as one of the most remarkable among the pilots of the Canadian Air Force, which I think is high praise indeed for an Air Force that was full of remarkable pilots.
Yeah.
Lloyd Chadburn never sought the spotlight or personal victories, yet he managed to achieve a commendable score. He had one probable victory off Dieppe, and the rest of his victories as leader of the Digby wing. He managed to accumulate a total of 8 destroyed and 6 probably destroyed, and as well as 2 E-boats destroyed and another damaged and a destroyer damaged. Post-war record comparison with the Germans reduced that score down to 6 confirmed aircraft, but he still gets to be an ace. Hugh Godfroy, contemporary of Chadburn's, flying with him in 403 Squadron under Johnny Johnson, and he's the guy who passed command of 127 Wing in April to take up a headquarters job. He survived the war, and he became a doctor in South Carolina. Reflecting on Chadburn long after the war, he said, "He was a wonderful fellow, respected and admired by every man who ever met him. I never knew anyone with such a faculty for leadership." These observations, along with Chad's citations, highlight his remarkable leadership. His tactical awareness in the air was exceptional. He could visualize all the moving pieces in 3 dimensions and give calm and concise orders to accomplish the mission of bringing the maximum guns to bear on the enemy. And the secret, of course, was calm and concise, because there's a lot of chaos on the radio. Chadburn's entire first 2 years were spent helping other pilots to get up to speed in operational flying. Without a doubt, it was the single greatest element in his success at Dieppe, where he pulled a surprise victory from the jaws of disaster. Chadburn, even when the wing commander, often took pilots under his wing to help them gain confidence. And on one such operation, Danny Noonan was on his wing, and they were involved in a dogfight chasing a German Messerschmitt. As they went into the clouds, Chad cheered him on. "Go get him, Danny," he said, and Noonan roars into the cloud. As soon as he sees an airplane, he fires his guns, but it turned out to be his own wing leader that he was shooting at. He stops immediately, but on the whole flight home, the wing leader is complaining that his engine is running a bit rough, and Danny is sweating. But when they got back to base, Noonan apologized for putting a bullet into his engine. Chad laughs, slaps him on the back, and says, "Don't worry about it, Danny. It's not the first time I've been shot at by our side." In the chaotic environment of aerial combat, Chadburn's calm voice over the radio helped maintain that composure amongst his pilots, and he enforced strict radio discipline, but exuded confidence. Notably, Chad became renowned for his unparalleled sense of aerial navigation. Despite his earlier struggles, he developed an uncanny ability to find his way home, even in the worst weather. And he often led his pilots, and even the bomber pilots, through the cloud, tightening formations as needed, but always emerging directly over the airfield. His pilots suspected he was receiving help from the ground control, and often laid traps to catch him, such as different pilots listening in on different frequencies. But no such assistance was ever uncovered. Just as important as his leadership in the air was his leadership on the ground. British innkeepers knew him as the laughing blonde Canadian, and he could always be counted on for a laugh and a quick pint, but only one to sharpen the eye, as he would say, as he would hold his mug up against his ears. He was very charismatic and engaging. And as Jackie Ray observed, Chad would say, "Let's go," and off we went. Oh, that got cut off too. It didn't matter where, as long as we were with him, in the air or on the ground. He was genuinely self-effacing and even self-deprecating. He was not a line shooter in the jargon of the day, not the least bit boastful. And every time a newspaper or a radio story mentioned him, he would cringe, knowing he was going to get some stick from the other pilots. And of course, he was mentioned a lot in newspapers, certainly back in Canada. He was just there to do a job. He was not there to gain any glory. This is not going to work out well. I'm going to be cranky about that in a minute. One of his greatest leadership attributes was genuine concern for the men in his command, including his ground crew and administrative staff. He took personal interest in their well-being, would draw them into conversations about home. And this is a picture of Wing Commander Jeff Northcott. Unfortunately, it's been cut off, and I'm cranky about that. He was one of Chad's squadron leaders and close friends. This photo was taken in February of 1945, 8 months after Chadburn's death. And clearly visible in his desk, you can't see it in this picture, would be a picture of his girl back home and that charcoal drawing of Lloyd Chadburn that he kept on his desk months and months and months after Chadburn died. In 1994, I had the opportunity to command the Air Cadet Squadron that was named after Lloyd Chadburn in Oshawa. And on the 50th anniversary of Chadburn's death, we had a memorial event there. And pilots and ground crew came from all across North America to remember him and have a bit of a reunion. At that event, I had the good fortune of meeting Ted Gladman. He was a corporal, a rigger at Digby Wing, and despite being in ill health, he traveled 2,400 kilometers or 1,500 miles from Texas to pay his respects. He would tell me he seemed to know every airman in the unit by his name, and he made a point of drawing each of us out in personal conversation. When we referred to him to our superiors, it was respectfully the wing commander or Mr. Chadburn. But amongst ourselves, he was affectionately Chad and one of us. Now, another funny story about that particular event, Jackie Ray, one of his pilots, and who was an officer, obviously, was at the same event. And Ted Gladman would still call Jackie Ray sir and talk about Mr. Chadburn. He wouldn't call him anything else, even though, you know, it was now 50 years after everything had transpired. I thought that was really remarkable. Art Sager, who was flying under Johnny Johnson and had run into a bit of flying trouble, was sent to Digby under Lloyd Chadburn and was discovered that it was actually a good move. Sager loved Chad dearly and continued to speak worshipfully of him until his death in 2007. Such was the impact that Chadburn had on him. In fact, I didn't know it at the time, but he literally lived around the corner from where I am currently living. He had died just before I moved here. In his diary, Art Sager's diary, published in 2002, called Line Shoot, Art Sager wrote about his impressions of Wing Commander Chadburn after just a few weeks at Digby. The adjective inspired was more than apt, as his leadership was effortless, stemming from character rather than the conscious act. It was felt by all, and when the Wingco visited dispersals and hangars, faces lit up. When Chad returned to England in April of 1944, he even called up Nancy, both told that she had left to get married. And despondent, he had called up Vera and spoke with her. And she had just gotten married the week before because she didn't think even he was coming back to England ever. So now he was completely torn up. What he didn't know was that the message about Nancy was wrong. It was a different Nancy that had left Hawkins to get married. His Nancy, on the other hand, was pregnant and gave birth to a son in September of 1944. But nobody knew anything about this until his son, Andrew, appeared out of the blue in 1992. This photo was taken when he visited the Air Cadet Squadron with his father's name, 50 years after his father visited the same place. And he was, without a doubt, the spitting image of his father. Jackie Ray, one of the original pilots of 416 Squadron in Peterhead when Chad took command, became a fast friend of his squadron leader, and he's going to get the final word on Lloyd Chadburn. When asked to describe him, Ray said, all of his citations are for leadership. That's just another word until you meet Wing Commander Chadburn.
Wow.
Thank you.
And there, folks, is the cover of the book. And I'd say the links to purchasing it are in the description below. Well, I mean, amazing. Someone just said about me, and they're talking about me in the sidebar there. So Gary Yorker said, you know how good this is. Woody is so quiet and fixated. And that pretty has much summed it up. I have been very quiet and fixated. And I have to make a big thank you to Karen, Chadburn's cousin, who has been responding and answering questions. That's why we haven't been putting many questions to you, Robert, because she's been addressing them as we've gone along. So it's been fantastic. We've got two for the price of one, a twofer, as you were saying. And so leadership. It comes down to leadership, and that's that. I wanted to quiz you about where you think it comes from. I mean, is it inherent? Is it built? I mean, you said it's based on character. For my interpretation, what you've been saying, he doesn't see people's ranks as being different. He doesn't see people's nationalities having influence. It's all about being part of a team. He emphasizes, in a sense, what got the Allies through World War II. It's not about individual prowess. It's about making sure a large team that outnumbers the enemy goes into engage the enemy. Doesn't matter what mark of Spitfire you've got. You make do with what you've got. You fulfill to the best of your abilities everything you're set to do, and you make sure you implement that kind of numerical and technological advantage the Allies have, and not kind of as I say over rely on individual skills. And yet paradoxically, his ability to be a good team player means attention is drawn to him because he somehow, as an individual, symbolizes the team effort that he's trying to encourage, if that makes sense.
I think, I mean, his natural leadership, I mean, I think that a lot of that might have come, when he was still in Canada, before he even joined the Air Force. I think that, he had his group of friends, and he was, a leader amongst them. And it was, so when he got to England and, learning the ropes of what being a pilot is, and learning about, how do I fit into this and what to do with airplanes, when he was still a very new pilot. But his natural leadership abilities was recognized early on. When he was there, and, it was only within, he was operational, and then he was very shortly after that, he was a section leader. And after he was a section leader, then he was, he became a wing leader, flight leader, and flight commander, and then he became a squadron. It was just all a very natural progression for him, I think, to just get a larger and larger component. But I think, like you said, it was not about me being in the front. Famously, when the Battle of Britain started, the Britain was flying their fighters in a 3 airplane Vic formation, stupidly and disastrously. And then they adopted the Finger 4, the German Rote and Schwarm, right? So you fly it like that, which they're still doing now, to this very day. But when they went into combat, against other units, their pilots, his pilots, would always observe. It was always line abreast. Everybody is just big wall of guns going to the enemy. So it's and you can't do that, without being trained to do that. And this is the thing that I've emphasized and was very clear throughout all of my research and all of the notes that I've uncovered in the course of this round. This is what Chadburn was all about: train, 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 train. And when you're finished training, go back and train, 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 train some more. And that's why, at Dieppe, first operation, first opportunity, bam, they nailed it, and nobody else did. Which was, I think it's really interesting that because he was just that new, but he was also the leader. So he had, I think he had some innate ability, but I think that he was well mentored by the guys who flew in the Battle of Britain in the Canadian Squadron. They really gave him the tools with which he could work.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, when you were talking about the rhubarb missions and the other operations of that era, is that when you were talking about that, I was thinking of the similar era, 1942, when like the various commando operations are happening around the world that often don't meet with the success they're supposed to, but they very much provide a framework and a foundation for things that happen later on. You see what the fledgling, LRDG or SAS are doing in North Africa as they're being a development. And it was that era of it really doesn't matter what we do as long as we're showing the enemy that we're up, that we're there, that we're in the war, we're doing stuff. But there was a lot of variety of flying in that, low level, high altitude, mid stuff, different types, the targets of opportunity. Do you think that was, despite the lack of obvious people saying that the rhubarb missions may have been a waste of time, do you think that that was actually integral to him becoming a better organizer, a better leader, and more flexible as a pilot? Because it seems to me he's a very good all-rounder, although that sounds a bit insulting and it implies he's not good at anything. He's quite good. But do you think that that kind of period there in 42 is actually more significant than perhaps it appears at face value?
I think the whole, I saw somebody had commented about, rhubarbs were a complete waste of bodies, and I can't disagree, because I mean, there was certainly a lot of unnecessary loss, both of pilots and airplanes, and pilots who were taken prisoner, etc., for very, very, very little return.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it also, as you said, I think it kept the Germans on the back foot, so to speak, with this constant chipping away. So I don't think that there's any, not until we get into, some of the big strategic bombing raids in 43, but I think, through 41 and 42, as we're trying to figure out how to conduct the war, it's this chipping away. This gnawing, the death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of thing, where none of them are particularly useful individually, but taken as a whole, I don't want to say it's completely useless, but it does elevate a readiness state, right?
Yeah.
And as Chadburn observed himself in his logbook, there was a point where he took the pilots over to see France, not because they were on any mission, but he would he would be there, just, here's France, boys, somebody's going to shoot at you now, boom, 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 look at that, they're shooting at you, you don't have to get too worried about the flak. So it was all about just developing his men all the time. Was really quite a remarkable thing to see or read about.
Thank you. And my other comment is about, obviously the tragedy of an irony of his death, in that he does all these incredible, death-defying, odds-defying operations earlier, the 100 escort missions, and then it's a collision that actually brings him down. And you talked about the fact that over the beaches on June the 6th, some units are engaging the Germans and some aren't, because they're just doing that general patrolling. And I always make the point in Normandy is the real period where the air power makes a difference is when you get towards late July and early August. Get to Cobra and the breakout of the Americans, you get to Totalize and Tractable and the Falaise Gap, and what sort of impact he'd have had with his wing in that era there. Personally, I'm obviously, everything carried on after his death, the operations carried on, but he wasn't there personally. And whether or not he would have recognized that was sort of the summit, in a sense, of how this team had been developing, the peak, I suppose you'd call it, because that's when I'm not saying the Air Force air power wasn't making a difference on June the 6th. I'm saying that it's August where it really
as a tactical unit, as for tactical support, it was just, it really came into its own in late July, and then from that point forward. One of the interesting things, and I don't really dwell on it too much in this book, because I don't really have a lot of proof on it, so therefore there it is. But I have a letter from Wally Conrad, who was the guy he almost plowed into, that Wally Conrad wrote to another historian, and this was 20 years ago. And Wally says, when Chad came back to England the last time, and he tried to get a hold of Nancy, and Nancy was gone, and he reaches out to Vera, and Vera's just gotten married, and it's like, and so he was very despondent about the whole thing. And Wally says that he was never really the same guy ever after that. You know, and I thought that's interesting. And you look in his logbook, and his logbook before 1944, all of the missions all detailed, and tapes and times and commentary. And you look in his logbook after that, date, plane, mission, and a story. There's hardly any text. And in fact, you look at it and you can see that a lot of it was mass entered, seven days at a time. And he stopped writing in his logbook on the 15th of May.
Wow.
So,
telling, very telling.
Different guy. Yeah, different guy. I think.
I think of the fact I'm 56 years old and I'm learning all the time. And, this is a 24-year-old lad. I mean, they talk about, it's a cliche, but they talk about, growing up fast in World War II when you're leading. And we think of people like Guy Gibson and Paddy Mayne and all these other legendary people who were, barely out of their teens, some of them doing what they did, and the responsibility they shouldered, not just for themselves, but for their men around. And I think that's what my takeaway from this particular show is the team effort, is that I tend to have the cliched view of the fighter pilot as being a little bit selfish, and I mean that in a very positive way. I mean, we needed those people to be a bit about themselves, because that's the nature of sometimes aerial combat and fighters. But he clearly wasn't that kind of guy. And I think that's what my takeaway will be, is that he just wanted to get the job done, recognize the men around him, the women around him, the fact that, the ground crew are just as important to him as the people who are flying alongside him. And I think, it's been extraordinary to chat to you, Robert. So, remind us, the book came out in May, so we can obviously, they can buy it online. Is it available in the Juno Center right now? Is it not there yet?
It is not there yet. I think I've sent it to them, but their shipment from Canada to Juno Center isn't until I think it's October.
Okay, so I won't race up there tomorrow to buy one yet, but I will go and get it.
I'll be back in Normandy next April. I'll be at the Juno Beach Center with another flock of books as they requested. So,
well, I will definitely hook up with you then. As someone else said, I think it was Jay White said it's really heartwarming to see two historians reunite after 23 years.
Yeah, awesome.
I mean, I can't believe that I've been doing it that long. The guiding. I mean, I was in my infancy then, probably saying a load of rubbish on the at the time I was. But it's the fact that you shared Chadburn's story, and I've always been sharing it. And I've got new stuff to add. My presentation by his grave will go from 20 minutes to 3 hours now, unfortunately. But there you go. So anyway, Robert, fantastic. I'll put the slide up there again just so people can see the photo of Lloyd and the cover of the book there. And I urge everybody to go and get it. It's obviously not. It's an aviation book in the sense it covers Spitfires and Hurricanes and whatever. But it's a person book, because I think some people watching some aviation books can get a little bit. And this is the week when they changed the fixings on the canopy from the so-and-so bolt with the so-and-so thread to this thread there. And that kind of bores me to tears, that.
Yeah.
But the people I'm fascinated by. So, folks, you know what to do. Go and get the book. Robert,
can you put that slide up for a sec? Again, I just want to have one more comment. So this photo of Lloyd Chadburn, he actually, when he arrived in England, he went to Lincoln. And he went to a photographer and he had his portrait taken, the fancy photography portrait. And he had a little booklet made of 48, it's almost like a contact sheet of little itty bitty pictures that you cut out and you hand out to people. Well, this was one of the pictures that were in that booklet. And this one was colorized and has sat on, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but this sat on his mother's house out in the open for all her life after that, and now it sits in Karen's house.
Brilliant stuff. Well, Karen will correct them. So I'm going to say let's not leave it 22 years again before we reconnect. Whether it's virtually or in person, I'll be around in April. Let's have a pint up somewhere near Ronville and talk about Chadburn. It's been fantastic. It was on Auntie Flo's. Oh, hang on, well, there we go. Auntie Flo's dresser in her bedroom. So there we are. So you were right. Right. we'll leave it there, folks. It's been fantastic listening to reading all your comments in the sidebar. Thank you, Robert, for an incredibly presentation.
Thank you so much, Paul. Great to talk to you again.
And thanks for Karen and with her contribution. So, folks, I'm back again twice tomorrow. We've got shows with John Willis and Lucy Colback, so check them. So I'm looking forward to that. But in the meantime, buy my guest books, sign up for the Patreon or YouTube channel membership, and I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Bye now.